Okay, so welcome to the second talk today. Andreas Wolf will give a talk about domain-driven design and TYPO3 and the missing parts here. Give him a round of applause, please.
So, how the mic test? Okay, yeah. So apparently I just need to speak louder. Yeah. So welcome. Yeah, some words about me. I recently moved to Cologne. Do TYPO3 since quite a few years. Okay, this supposed to work like this? Okay. Yeah, so I'm part of the education committee, which is also one of the reasons I'm standing here. To improve education about TYPO3, I do the TCCD and TCCC certifications. And I've also been part of the core team for quite some time. Yeah, so I've got a little quiz for the beginning. Does anyone of you know where this is? Washington is, yeah, Washington is correct. And can you imagine what this large crowd was there for? Obama, yeah, correct. There was January 20th, 2009, the inauguration of President Obama, the first one. But that date, and I was actually laughing when I discovered that date was not only changing history for the US, but also for TYPO3. Because on that date, the first commit for Xbase was made. On the exact same date. And I was like, how old is Xbase exactly? And I was like, okay, 2009 something, and then I discovered 20th of January, and I've been to the US when Trump came into office, and that was also 20th of January, I think. And then I looked it up, and actually it was the exact same date, and that was just some funny coincidence. Yeah, so Xbase, as you have seen in the commit already, is a backport of Flow 3, now called Flow. First commit was more than 10 years ago, and the first release was with the next version then, version 4.3. And that was basically the first point where we had real MVC and object relational mapping, ORM, and DDD in TYPO3. And yeah, what is DDD? Who doesn't know anything about DDD here? Okay. Good. Yeah, so DDD is some concept, some methodology that was introduced or coined roughly 15, 16 years ago. 2004, the first book came out, the blue one. This is also the one that was read by the people who did Flow and later Xbase. And there's a second book that came out after Xbase was invented or was created. Which explains some concepts a bit better. To just give a short introduction or short ground definition what domain-driven design actually is about, the basic principle is that software should not be written with technical concepts, but it should reflect business concepts and processes. And for that should use the language of the business. One important term is the ubiquitous language, which means domain experts, like the people who actually do the business, know the business, like banking or insurance or other popular examples. And the people writing the software should agree to common terms, and also the technological people need to gather an understanding of the business domain that allows them to actually write software where the concepts can be understood by the business people, because they need to work with it, and they also need to confirm, okay, that model is correct, that model is not correct, because you didn't understand or didn't account for these and these facts and things. And that becomes easier if you use a common language, common terminology. So this is one of the founding principles of domain-driven design. And the other one is that the software should have an explicit business domain layer. And this, but there is quite some discussion around all this. One of the things that came out of these discussions is the so-called hexagon or hexagonal architecture, which consists of a core domain, which is what makes up your actual business. Like, for example, if you're in insurance, it's probably contracts and risks and stuff like that, risk assessment. This is something that you can't buy, but you have to implement yourself because it's the heart of your business. The domain around here is something that you might, in parts at least, buy from others, commodity software. And the application is the thing that is built around this core domain. And a framework like Xbase is actually the thing that sits around all of this. And this is probably some point where we already see that Xbase or the concepts that Flow implements are not the ideal solution, because they actually mix two important things. This core domain and domain that is implemented in your own extensions, and this framework aspect. And I myself don't believe that a framework can actually support you in implementing your business domain, like, for example, something like an extension generator can not really help you with a business domain, because that's something that you need to really model with domain experts, and that's not something that you can just auto-generate, because if you can auto-generate it, it belongs more here into the application part and not into the core domain part. So the question that I ask myself now is, why should I come up here and tell you something about this? And this goes back to, for example, this book. Unfortunately, there is no, so only the Germans are laughing. The title is Become, or don't, I didn't actually translate it up front. Yeah, programming less bad, or don't, or suck less at programming. So this is just one example. There are lots of books out there that can help you, like pattern books and other books. And even if you think you're the best programmer on earth, this book can still help you. This was actually tweeted by the author of the book 2 weeks ago. And she was actually glad, because I'm always happy when someone finds one of my books useful. That was the text she tweeted that with. Yeah, so my reason for standing here is actually that I want to not rant against Xbase or against DDD or whatever. I just want to share some insights that I got from working with Xbase and working with other frameworks, other languages, and also doing some development outside of the TYPO3 world. And I want to give back some of that insight, some of that knowledge. Yeah, and I got 5 points, 5 common things I think are not done good with Xbase, or are also not well implemented in Xbase. But more on that later on. First, some general insight on how DDD is done in TYPO3. Flow 3 initially introduced DDD, among other things, into the community. And Xbase then brought these concepts back to TYPO3. In the beginning, it was meant as a way to now create Xbase extensions and later on port them to Flow 3. Well, we all know how good that has turned out, but in general, that was the first time that we got also structured programming in TYPO3. Like, if you've ever seen 4, 5, 6,000 line long classes in PI-based extensions, then you know what I'm talking about. Xbase was the first time that we actually brought a common structure to extensions, and I think that was a huge step forward. The only problem is that Xbase itself was based on an early version of Flow. And the other thing is that framework and core domain and domain, in my opinion, should be separated. I think that's not only my opinion, that's a general fact. If you remember this architecture diagram, you can pretty clearly see that. And also Xbase, DDD was a pretty new concept when we started with it around 2006-07, I think. Was when that was first brought up in the community and was hyped as the tool. And it's great for complex problems, but not every problem is complex. Like, you maybe know that if your only tool is a hammer, then every problem suddenly starts looking like a nail. And that is kind of like how the TYPO3 community started treating problems. Everything was implemented in Xbase, even if it doesn't make any sense. Like I think one example I've seen is a copyright note displayed in the bottom of the page. That was an Xbase controller, uncached. And the only reason for doing this was to render the current year. So there was a date function in there that rendered the current year, and then that was returned. And you can imagine the overhead that meant. This is probably one example where DDD and Xbase are not put to good usage. One side note for this, a block is not complex. If you've followed the development of Xbase a bit, the prime example how Xbase was always introduced at camps, developer days, etc., was the blog example. That was basically the guest book of the 2000s. In the 90s, we all had programming examples or had guest books as the 101 application in a new framework. In the 2000s, that was a blog. But this is not something where you can really highlight how domain-driven design helps you developing or designing an application. This is more like, this is how the MVC framework works, but not domain-driven design. Yeah, so what are the 5 issues? I've already spoiled one of them. DDD, all the things, is not how we should tackle that. Not everything is a complex problem, and DDD is for complex problems, so that's probably something that we should keep in mind. I don't say don't use Xbase then, but don't try to overcomplicate stuff with using DDD. The rule of thumb for me personally is, does it have any business rules? Like, imagine, for example, an address change. If there's any business rules behind that, like an address change has to be in at least 2 weeks in advance, so we can adjust everything in our internal systems, then that's something that should be modeled in the software, and that should have that is a business rule, and that should have some reflection in the code. In contrast, front-end users are probably not complex enough for being tackled with DDD. But this is also something, if your front-end users have some complex logic behind them, then that might as well be something that you can tackle with DDD. And one issue that I see with Xbase, which I don't blame anyone for, but it's just a matter of fact, Xbase has a lot of things in it. One part is the ORM persistence, which is its own topic in itself, which I'm not going to tackle here because that's another talk, basically. Then there is a full MVC framework in there, and it also brings these DDD concepts, and everything is like mixed up with everything else. And there's no clear separation between the things. Some things, as I already mentioned, are also useful without DDD. So you can just leave out all that modeling stuff, apart from what the framework forces upon you, of course. But you can also use these things like MVC and an ORM and persistence without relying on any DDD concept. And one thing I find tremendously useful is this clear separation that you have with the repositories. When I write code today, even if it's not in Xbase, even if it's not in TYPO3, I usually always have a repository that has some find methods and stuff like that, that clearly separates the data access in one class, and then I have the model or whatever in other classes. And this allows for clear encapsulation of data access. Even if I just access in-memory stuff, this is always in a repository. And this is something that I learned from Xbase and from looking a bit beyond Xbase, and that's probably something that you can easily adopt. Yeah, so much for the first issue. The second one is getters and setters everywhere, and this is actually I think the heart of what I want to present here, because I think that's the main reason why Xbase extensions often suck. That everything is done with getters and setters. Part of that is necessary because of the framework, how the framework works, but I think this often makes for bad code and bad design. Because models are treated as mere data containers. This is something that you see in other patterns, like the active record pattern. So you just have a class that basically directly reflects the database. And usually, because you just have getters and setters in the model, the domain logic is somewhere else, in huge controllers, which is basically then the exact equivalent of old PI-based extensions that have not 5,000 lines now, but maybe 500. But still, all the logic is encapsulated in the controller, and it's impossible to really see the business domain in that. And also, these utility classes are a total anti-pattern. If I ever catch anyone calling something ... utility, I'm gonna find you and haunt you. Seriously, don't put stuff in utility classes, because that's just a bad name. Try to find a useful name for that, or put it into some model, because it actually belongs there, or put it into some domain service, for example. But don't put it in a utility, because the utility is... What is a utility? It doesn't do anything by itself normally. It's just, bad naming. And the problem is that what DDD normally says is that entities and models, or what we call models is called entities in DDD, roughly speaking, should care for their own consistency. But this is not done in Xbase. All the consistency checks that the framework forces upon you are done by external validators. So you can specify the validation rules in the model, but the validation itself is triggered at points where the model doesn't have any control, or that the model doesn't have any control over, and it's not... or the consistency is totally in the hands of external components. The model itself doesn't have any control over that, unless you implement it yourself, of course. And this is what, in DDD terms, later on got called an anemic domain model. Anemic, lack of blood, so it basically lacks life. It's just a bloodless, lifeless data container, and doesn't do anything in itself. And I and some other people as well, so I'm not alone here, call this or see this as an indicator for bad software design. So what DDD actually wants is encapsulating business logic in models, and also that the model is responsible for its own state. And in turn, then you get slim controllers, which also means you can use the same model in different contexts. Okay, we now have this web-based workflow where users can do something, and the next week we suddenly need to, import external data and throw that at the same methods. No problem with this. If you have a 500 lines controller that is in the web context, good luck. So just don't put stuff into getters and setters, or don't put your domain logic into controllers, put it into models, or if you need multiple models to cooperate, then have some intermediate thing called a domain service. That's basically the essence. For the second issue, any questions? If you have any questions, just interrupt me, because that's basically the first time I give this talk in that way. So there might be things that I missed or that are not understandable because I didn't explain them well. Okay, apart from that, the third issue is value objects. Who has ever used value objects in Xbase? You probably know the pain. All others will experience it now. Now the thing is, value objects are, well, there is something in Xbase that's called a value object, but it's not a real value object. So what is a value object in DDD terms? Value objects are encapsulations. There's also a pattern that was invented before DDD called flyweight that is roughly similar. It's just an encapsulation for data. The object is defined by its values. It doesn't have any identity. So if you have two objects, I have an example later on, two objects that have the same properties, they are treated as equal because they don't have any identity. They are not stored in the database by itself. They are also immutable, so if you want to modify it, you get back a new object, and the old object lives happily ever after because you can reuse them. Like, for example, you define a point that has two coordinates, and that is encapsulated. And that encapsulation allows you to, for example, check are these values allowed. Like, for example, I can't have negative x or y components in my coordinates. This is something that the point class can then check, and that is what makes those value objects tremendously useful. They also have a comparison method, so you can easily tell this value object and this value object are equal, because you can't rely on the object pointer in memory. And I think they should be stored together with their entities, which is not how it's done in Xbase. Because in Xbase, there are value objects. They are stored in their own table. And they have a UID, so they have an identity, which is no. But at least there is code that deduplicates. So there's only, each value combination is only stored once. So that's at least something. So I think it's more a value entity, than a real value object. So what should a proper value object look like without any reference to Xbase? So first thing, final class, because you can't extend it. And it should have private properties. Well, if you can't extend it, it doesn't make sense to have them protected. But that's just a detail. And as you can see, you pass all the values with the constructor, because you can't modify them later on, because the object is immutable. So everything that the object contains has to be passed in the constructor. And the comparison method checks if the other object is of the same class and if the two object properties are equal. And that's it. And if they are equal, then they can be treated equally. So what should that look like in the database now? As you've seen, we've got this point class with x and y components, or x and y properties. And then we have a rectangle that is probably defined by two points. You can define a rectangle by two adjacent corners. And well, for simplicity and because I ran out of space, I just have one here, which is the origin. And my implementation idea would be to have a var of the type point, and then have this add inline annotation, which basically means this is something that is stored in the same database row as this rectangle. So the rectangle probably has an identity because, I don't know, it has a color and a name, and you treat it like a pet. But you don't actually care about the point, and the point can just be stored with the rectangle. This is a pretty simple example. There are others, like, for example, you have an address object and stored it with your front-end user. You don't want to have a separate table, probably, for the addresses, but just want to store them inline, but still have a dedicated address object that you can just exchange with one method, and don't have to write all the single components of the address. So in the database, that basically could look like this. We've got the x and y components prefixed with the name of the property in the parent class. So we've got the rectangle table that has a UID and PID because you can store rectangles on pages for whatever reason. Yeah, the two components are stored in the same table, and then when the object is loaded from the database again, this is again restored into two objects, the rectangle with the point inside the rectangle, and the same would go for a front-end user with its address. That is also a separate object. So this is a pretty simple example, but I think there is more to value objects that could also benefit outside of custom extensions. They are not only useful in entities, but also against an anti-pattern that's called stringly typed programming by some people. So we've got strongly typed programming in languages like, I don't know, Scala or others, C++, that actually force you to use proper types and that don't let you cast, or well, you can still cast, but you have to do it explicitly. If you have a string, it's a string and not an integer in some situations, or, I don't know, a float in other situations, or a Boolean in some situations, and then suddenly an empty string becomes false, but a 1 becomes true. This is something that can happen in PHP, and that happens quite often. If you don't really, if you're not really careful while programming. And we have a lot of stringly typed values in TYPO3 in a lot of different places. Like, for example, pages:10 that is used in some places, or ttcontent_6 that is used, for example, for relations to content elements. We've got this beautiful new 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that is used in data handler to mark new records. And we've also got the special PID -1 for workspaces, which is a special value that you have to treat differently, but you have to know of this about the special meaning and have to treat it at every location where you basically treat PIDs. And you might have a negative PID, or might have a workspace, or might be in a workspace context. Then you have to check if it's actually a workspace context. This is abstracted away by some API methods, but still, this is a special value with hidden meaning, and it's unclear where exactly this is used, because everything is just strings and integers all around the place. So stringly typed programming is not only about strings, but also about other primitive values or primitive types that are used in places where you could actually have something more meaningful, being a value object that just encapsulates something like, this is a record reference to pages, or to the table pages and to record number 10, or this is a new record with the identity something, or this is the workspace version, workspace X or workspace Y, and this could all be used instead of these stringly typed values. One example where probably everyone has been bitten by this is this beauty, treat ID as reference. This is something that we actually screwed up when implementing the file abstraction layer, which is why I took the example, because I'm responsible for a large part of that mess. The problem is this is part of the fImageView helper. And here only a UID is passed without any context. And because we have files and file references, which both have UIDs, you might sense the problem. Is it a file? Is it a file reference? No one knows, not even me. That's why we needed this additional parameter that you basically have to set, but you always have to keep in mind, am I dealing with file references here, or am I dealing with files? And if you screw that up, you're in trouble. Probably not in as much trouble as he is, but still enough trouble to, for example, break your production site. And if we had something like this class, record identity, that basically keeps the track of the table and the UID, and keeps track of that all throughout the core, in all the usages that you have, then this would be a lot easier. And then we could also have these two beautiful factory methods that take stuff like pages:1 or ttcontent_1 and turn them into a record identity, into an instance of this class. And from that point on, we can just pass on that class everywhere in the core, and also extensions, if you like. Yeah, so much for value objects. I think this is, in general, this is an approach that we should use not only in persistent or in stuff that is persisted, but also in other places where we need to reuse or use things that have any meaning beyond just a simple string. Like, for example, some record identity or other identities that are passed around and that carry some meaning. Okay, so for the fourth issue that I see, this is about domain records or models or forms, more specifically. If you have a form and submit that form to an Xbase controller, then there is some advanced logic magic happening in the background that takes the incoming request, HTTP request, and maps it to your domain model that you specified in the parameters of that action. The problem is, again, this is using getters and this is using setters and writing directly to the model and changes the model without the model having any control. Done by setters, and the validation is only on afterwards. So you have an incoming request that is stored or mapped to the domain model, and validation is run afterwards. So the model is in an inconsistent state already. Some invariants might be violated, like, I don't know, you specified this can only be between 0 and 255. Someone enters 300 and suddenly the IP address is invalid, for example. Then the object is already in an inconsistent state. It had no control of that, so this is not domain-driven design. But it's just some MVC mechanism that pretends to be DDD. And yeah, the property mapping changes model. There might be an inconsistent state. Validation can't fix that, but at least it saves you from persisting this wrong state, because there are no additional checks after validation to keep you from having an invalid state in the database. So validation is your last resort, basically, to keep that from becoming invalid. So how is that? You didn't raise your hand. You just okay, good. So how could that be done better? I think we should stop mapping stuff to models directly. Instead, we should introduce something called DTOs, data transfer objects, or form objects, if you like, and then pass these objects to a controller that then passes them to an entity into a domain method, and the entity then decides, okay, is that form object valid? Do I want to process that? And this also enables better error handling. Currently, if validation fails, you just get a generic validation failed error and have some validation results somewhere. But the domain layer can't actually react to any errors that occur. This is all happening before because it's done by the framework and all is handled by the framework. This is nothing that your action, because the request doesn't reach the action if the validation fails, this is something that you can't handle in the action currently. And this is, in my opinion, this is where it belongs, because it's something, it's part of the domain if something went wrong, and that should only be handled by the framework for very easy cases, but not for advanced cases. But there is no distinction between that. It's not possible at the moment to really keep that apart. For these DTOs or form objects, validation is still useful, because you can still specify, okay, I want some string in there and I want a number here between 0 and 200. and this is optional. This is something that you can specify with validation, but for DTOs or form objects, not for your entity. The entity should maintain its own state. And this is how that could look. Actually, the example is not that good. That's why I'm going to skip it. And also because I'm running out of time. No, the thing is, the important point that I just realized while talking about it is, this shouldn't be two fields here. There should just be one address object in here. This address object should somehow be created from this address change DTO. Because this way we just, again, have the same structure in here as we had before. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, for the fifth and last issue with DDD, this is probably one that is is one of the easiest to tackle because it's just some configuration, and also I think just a mind shift, and not so much technology that is required. And this is one model to rule them all. One thing that we've seen, or that we see a lot in Xbase, or especially in more complex Xbase extensions, is that everything is put into one model. You've got large database tables. The core is also guilty of that. And everything from these database tables is mapped to one single big class. And that's probably not the best approach for this, but this is like the easiest way to do it, because you get all the benefits of Xbase, like automatic mapping and stuff like that. But I still think it's worth, if your model becomes a bit more complex, to think about splitting it up into different models. Because many tables hold complex data, the models become equally complex, and it becomes hard to see the actual domain in there. And as I said, the core is is also guilty of that. I've got two examples for that. And the main problem with all of this modeling is this pretty famous quote. All models are essentially wrong, but some at least are useful. And the usefulness of a model, I think, is by a large degree determined determined by how much it's focused on doing one thing and doing that thing correctly. And in the core, it's especially difficult because some tables mix so many different concerns. And how can you now separate this? One example is having a write model and a read model. If your writing part is more complex and the read part is more simple, like, for example, such a read model could aggregate data from different tables. Like if you have relations and you have a view that just needs some part of this relations, this is one prime example for having a read model. Whenever you want to put add lazy to an annotation, this is probably an indicator that you need another model here. Or in the core, we've got some cases where we've got outer and inner structure mixed together, for example, with the pages table. Or if you have custom fields for a front-end user, for example, this is also something that might be good in a separate model and not in the 2000s extension of the core-provided Xbase front-end user model. But there are also other use cases or other cases. These are just examples. I think it's best to probably start looking at problems and trying to figure out how you can, or where the complexities are, where the pain points are in your models, and then trying to separate that. And as promised, I've got two examples how the core mixes different concerns in one table. If you look, for example, at the pages table, this has information about sites, because there's this is site root flag. It has information about the site structure with the PID relations and sorting. It also has page metadata and also the page layout. which are totally different concerns that shouldn't be mixed up and shouldn't be put into one model because nobody's going to understand that model. And I'm not interested in how the page looks in the front end if I try to generate a menu, right? Or I'm not interested in where is this page placed in the page tree if I try to figure out how is it rendered in the front end, which page layout do I need, how many columns are there, blah, blah, blah. This is not the point where I'm interested in the structure or which site is it in. That might become interesting because of some additional constraints, because this layout is just usable in this part of the page tree. But that's not something to tackle when you generate the page. This is something to tackle when you actually let someone change the page. So in the back end, this information has to be available, but in the front end, while rendering the page, that's not interesting. And the same goes for TT content. This actually has the structure of the page, which content is on it, the order of the content, the position, colpos, also the content types that I need for rendering, and also the content itself. But these are also 3 domains that can be easily separated. So yeah, as we see, these complex tables have multiple roles each, and I think there should be one model per role. It doesn't have to be a class, but this is probably also something that can ease thinking about all these different aspects. If we just decide to separate these contexts, which is also a term from DDD, bounded contexts. I'm not sure if DDD practitioners would actually call that bounded context, but I think we should separate these different contexts and define what is part of which context, and then, yeah, basically make it easier to think about all these different things and different aspects of how TYPO3 handles content in different situations. Okay, that was basically it. I'm just gonna quickly recap all the 5 things so you can also try to take something away from today. So the first issue is that DDD is applied to everything without any regard. Is that really a complex problem? Do we need DDD for that? Because not all problems are complex enough to require DDD, and Xbase is a general purpose framework. You can use it without any knowledge about DDD or without using these DDD concepts that are actually hard and actually require a complex problem to really thrive. If you just try to model everything as a DDD problem, then you're going to end up with some badly hammered nails in your wall. The second problem, this is probably something that is more practical and easily applicable to daily work, getters and setters everywhere. The domain logic belongs to domain models, not controllers, which means setters are actually an anti-pattern. Unfortunately, the data mapper that reconstructs objects from the database requires setters. So you can't totally get rid of them or can't get completely rid of them, but at least you shouldn't use them in your own applications. So if you ever have to call set something, think 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and if you still think you need a setter, then you're probably still wrong, but you can, you have my absolution then, you can do that, but still try to think about how you could prevent that, or if there's a better method name here. Even if it does the same as the setter, try to encapsulate what your actual business requirement is with the method name, and not setting something is not a business requirement. It's usually changing something or updating something, but it's just setting something doesn't have any business value, normally. Yeah, so the third thing is value objects. Xbase doesn't have real value objects. They are useful. Yeah, but as I said, Xbase doesn't have them, and value objects could benefit the whole core. I think I have to speed up a bit. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Xbase directly maps to models, which can lead to inconsistent state, and the model doesn't have real control over its state. And also, these models are often too complex and too big, and thus hard to understand. We have different contexts that probably need different models that can use the same database row, but still be separate models. And these these different contexts are, I think, a useful thought model. So one final note, I don't think the current state is that bad. I think we just need some education. We don't need to change so much in the technology. There are huge improvements possible by small changes, like getting rid of setter requirements, and we can also integrate third-party packages, like, for example, the object mapping. For the object mapping, the Design TYPO3 might be good, but that's just an idea that I had. So I hope you had at least one moment like this and learned something today. That was it.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we
No
don't...
time for questions?
No time
Okay.
for questions, sorry.
See me in a break, or just drop me an email or contact me on Twitter or Slack.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And don't forget to vote for this talk, how you liked it. Thank you.